Welcome to The Authority File, the podcast that features conversations about the life cycle of scholarly communication. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. In this series, which is brought to you with generous support from Taylor and Francis, we're going to be talking about open research and how libraries can play an important role in supporting it. Farther upstream than open access, open research is a collaborative, transparent research workflow. As open access strives to make accessibility to scientific output more universal, open research works in a similar way with the research process itself. And lately, libraries are finding that they can occupy a unique role in providing services for their research communities, such as informatics, data management, and navigating reproducibility requirements. My guests for the next 4 episodes include Natya Hans, Informatics and Reproducibility Librarian, Academic Research and Consulting Services Department at the University of Florida, Emily McElroy, Vice President of Academic Relations at Taylor and Francis, and Jamie Hutchins, Director of Open Research Americas at Taylor and Francis. In this episode, we explore ways libraries can help navigate open research policies, how open research can improve research integrity, and what a post-collections world may look like. This episode also happens to be the 400th of the Authority File, another major milestone since we launched this award-winning podcast 7 years ago. So thank you for being a loyal listener, and thank you to all of our sponsors who've helped make these series possible. I want to sort of take a hypothetical here and pretend there's a library that has not really done anything to support open research, but they want to. What advice would you provide to that library on getting started with that? Jamie, I guess we'll start with you, and then Emily and Natya will follow up with you. But how, as a publisher, how are you advising libraries on that issue?
So we have a lot of information available, and like many publishers, we put them on websites aimed at librarians, and we hope that they find them.
Mm-hmm.
So we know that doesn't always work.
Right.
Okay. So I think my main piece of advice really would be that as a librarian, don't be afraid to reach out to a publisher. I think we've always had these relationships where we're quite often referred to as a vendor.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we're trying to move towards a more of a partnership-based approach in the future. That means different kinds of conversations can happen between people within a library. And as we've already discussed, people within a library aren't necessarily the same people that used to be in a library. There are lots of different specialties developing in those libraries. So you can engage with a publisher in different levels as well. So I think, especially for smaller libraries, don't assume that the only time of the year you can talk to a publisher is when you make an acquisition.
Right. Okay. Emily and Natya, I mean, what are some of the internal conversations that might be going on in that respect?
I think one of the things in your hypothetical scenario, I'm hoping that if a library decides to get involved in open research, it's because it's really important to the institution
Mm-hmm.
and it matches those goals. So one of the things that I would do is then ask for financial assistance for positions that will support that as an important first step. And then I think it is having been in that position where really starting from scratch is in the pool of candidates to enter that environment is looking for someone from that field who can step in. And then if at the same time, I've also been in other situations where there are plenty of opportunities out there, like data institutes. A lot of groups have stepped in, National Library of Medicine, with different training programs and things like that. So it is possible for someone to build up their skills in that area. I think when it comes to the publishing side of things, there are a lot of librarians who've been involved in this in areas touching on publishing that can pivot towards open access and best practices for publishing. That's probably a little bit easier than maybe the data side.
Natya, anything you want to add?
I agree with everything that's been said so far, but I also will add that in this hypothetical scenario, when we are talking about a library that has not, other than the fact that they need to make sure that they have their staffing needs met, because that's a huge part of the equation, um, the resources, there's a ton of resources available for them to use, but I think it's easier to curate that if they already work with a library that has done that already. So fostering those collaboration with bigger institutions who have open open research and open source models, who have worked with this, improving and make, because they know the challenges, they know the struggles with actually reaching out with the researchers, reaching out to the publishers, like they have seen both sides of it. So I think talking to the people who have done that, learning from their experiences, that, and also it gives more opportunity for collaboration, more opportunities for making sure that we are reaching out and helping the community essentially.
Mm-hmm. Just curious, are open research services in a library, does that tend to be like a sort of a dedicated unit, or can you have a few specialists such as Nadia and then pull in the talents of other librarians, sort of in an adjunct, I guess, capacity to sort of help with those services?
I think what I saw is based on that work that I was doing looking at digital humanities
Mm,
areas, is that usually you have a digital humanities unit, or
okay.
in the case of University of Florida, where you have the academic research consulting and services group that brings them together. But then I think if you go to a smaller library, it could be a subject specialist who has experience, say, for example, in author rights, copyright. And
Mm,
then you have maybe your metadata librarian who is no longer doing as much metadata for collections, has expressed interest in supporting data needs on campus. And so through some training, so that in that kind of scenario, it could come across departments.
right.
But I think that libraries are starting to develop a core unit.
Okay. Yeah. Because I was also thinking like outreach specialists or liaisons and that kind of thing might be able to interface as well.
Well, and I would say that is a critical issue because that outreach of what's available
Yeah.
is absolutely critical to the success of that department and for the institution to realize that the value that the libraries bring.
Mm,
And in my experience, what I've noticed is that sometimes some of these topics are kind of scary, and there might be a lack of familiarity with, well, what is informatics, or what is a natural language processing librarian. And so, but that's our core group that needs to be able to promote the services because they're often the ones meeting with students and faculty. And if they can make those connections for these specialized positions, it's very important.
right. Excellent. So we've the phrase research integrity has come up quite a bit. So I want to address that. I mean, how do open research initiatives improve research integrity? And do they have the potential to help shift research culture, for example, away from competition toward collaboration?
I can start this off. I think hopefully Emily will also have a bit of and Natya will have some things to add here as well. I mean, we talked about some of these before. So promoting trust in research and researchers themselves, I think, is the core
Yeah.
issue right now. So research integrity, making sure things have been through a rigorous process. I think that works pre-publisher, it works at the publisher, and it works post-publication as well. Ensuring that rigorous conduct of research has happened. So we talked about a number of those issues here, even from the conceptualization of your research project. I think open research has the potential to change the way people think about their entire project and to offer opportunities through the research life cycle to make some of their data available, to really adjust as they move along and to do that in a way that's visible to
Mm,
others and not just locked away. I think that the transparency that we've talked about as well, it focuses on the complete reporting of research. So not just the final interpretation and your opinion, but also making the data and software the code available as part of your outputs.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that changes the trust, because you can actually go and interrogate the data yourself. And sure, part of research is having an opinion, interpreting the data. It doesn't mean that's the only interpretation. So I think that's a really important thing that changes. And then continuing the focus on dissemination. So even though I differentiated open access and open research, it is still vital, and I think a really important part of this is that dissemination and interpretation of research is one of the ways in which we promote trust.
Right. Emily, anything you want to add?
I defer to Natya because her role is so key in this.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all the things Jamie said about having to build the trust among the researchers, because I think that's one of the fears that we have, that, oh, if I share my research openly, this might be taken against me. Like, will I be questioned about how authentic it is, or they might just use my data for other purposes. And I think it leads to transparency and increasing that trust. Building that trust is a one key step for sure. Everybody has a different bias against how they do the research as well. When you go into the research, they have notions of how they want the research to go. So this helps also in decreasing that bias, because you might have some bias when you're starting the project, but not the other research project, not the other people who are working in the same area might have as well. So yeah. I think that's what I wanted to add. Definitely would decrease the bias and increase transparency for sure.
Excellent. Emily, one more chance. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, I was just thinking about, because we've been talking about the humanities and social sciences, a piece of this that comes up is ethnographic research. And talking with a colleague of mine about the sensitivities around this, especially field notes, and how, so not only around research integrity, but also this concept of sharing that and protecting the privacy and the rights of those who you're interviewing. And how do you maintain that, especially in an environment where things can be scraped? I mean, technologies that we didn't anticipate are just moving through. So those who did it maybe in the 1930s is very different from how you would do it in 2024.
Mm-hmm. Good point. Yeah, I guess we're talking about levels of trust here. So there's trust between researchers and sort of opening themselves up, as Natya said, to sharing their research. But also, I think, Jamie, you were talking about trust from the general public in the results that research is putting out. Yeah, and I guess technology too. I mean, AI, for example, has some work to do there. So I guess, open research, I suppose, contributes to all those levels of trust in that equation.
I think that's the ambition, at least.
Yeah.
I think one of the issues, I think generally when you're talking public access, is whether there's understanding of the scientific methodology, and really understanding that every research project is a point in time, using the technologies and our understanding of that discipline at this point. Things change as we move along, and I think there are things like, in terms of trust or evidence, is really important.
Right.
So there's a concept of higher levels of evidence being something like a meta-analysis, as opposed to just a research note, which is a single point in time. I don't think that's generally understood, and obviously with the sort of media as well, tends to focus on the latest buzz.
Mm-hmm.
That's their job, if you like. But I think that's where it's really important for publishers, certainly academic and scholarly publishers, for libraries, the societies that we work with as well, to really start to educate and take perhaps a more active role in understanding how research happens and how publications themselves aren't the end point. They're all building on each other to a new destination.
Right.
One thing I'd like to add to that about misinformation is, and I want to take off my librarian hat, working for a publisher hat for a second, and go to one of the objectives of open access is to make information available to the public, especially when they're dealing with illnesses. And just yesterday, as a personal person, I am on a listserv for patients with similar issues, and there was someone referenced a new use of a drug that could help with this particular condition, and I went to go click on the link, and I couldn't access it. And if I had still been working in a library, oh sure, I would have been able to access that. So as a
Right.
member of the general public, I was really frustrated
Mhm.
that I couldn't see that latest research. And I know that now I could go and I could probably do some searches and find that. But does the average citizen do that? And I think that's what happens when we sometimes read the news. We hear about a new discovery or something, and then as additional studies happen, they find out that, oh, maybe it's not the miracle that we thought it was. But it was really interesting last night to run into that in my role. And I thought, yeah, this is why open access is great. I would have been able to read that article.
Yep. Yep. Good point. So in a previous discussion, Jamie and Natya, you discussed the impact of a, quote, post-collections world in librarianship. And that was an intriguing phrase. So I'm wondering if you could expand on that a little bit. How are libraries, in effect, I guess, moving away from that collection development concept into other roles? And how does that coincide with, in this case, stronger partnerships with the research office?
I mean, actually, that was a discussion that Emily and I are having, Bill. And
Oh, I'm sorry.
it was before we worked together, actually. And it was a throwaway phrase that she used and stuck with me. And it's kind of interesting how those things are, they still do stick with you sometimes. But I think when you're working or in my case, working in an open access, open research partnership environment, we're already in a post-collection world. We're not really talking about how many of these products do you want to buy and in what form and over how many years, and do you want perpetual rights for those to be attached? Although that
True.
is an important part of the discussion we have. I think the suggestion that Emily had there is that she, as an administrator at that time, and libraries are moving into different directions, and we've talked about that quite a lot today. And they're expanding their remit and their role,
Yeah.
and I don't know that that's necessarily fully understood even on campus.
Mm-hmm.
So it was, I think it was a throwaway thing, but it was certainly moving away from this idea of just in case collecting
Exactly.
towards being more purposeful. And from our perspective, moving away, hopefully, from that vendorship I described to real partnerships. And that's a big transition, at least.
Yep. Did you get it right, Emily?
Yeah, I think so. And it was funny because when he brought this up, I thought I said that. But I do think it's important, as someone who came from a collections background for most of my career, moving into an administrative role. I think that one of the things is when we think about the future of libraries, how will our work evolve and align more closely with the demographic changes within an institution and the goals of the research office, and then develop a staffing plan that maintains the strengths of the library. And no matter what, the universities will always appreciate the libraries for what they bring in terms of their collections, especially special collections. But it also, when I think about it, I also think about our philosophical views in terms of collections and bringing that content to our students and to our faculty. And in this world of the Nelson memo is also understanding the challenges of our philosophical beliefs with the reality that's facing our institutions and the administrative burden for faculty. And if we don't recognize that and realize that cost, then we fail. And so I think that one of the things ARL just recently this year released a study of what open data brings that cost. And it was for institutional and researchers, it was about 2.5 million. And for the individual researcher, it was nearly 30,000 estimated costs. And they just recently, I think even this week, announced a new cohort looking at this. And we have to think about that environment. And especially as we are moving with transformative agreements and various mandates, what does this mean for the funding flow? And what does this mean? Do we set aside some of those philosophical beliefs and think about the global environment, and the challenges and the administrative burden that our researchers are facing, and think of new ways of providing that support? And so that's, I think, one of the other things that I think about a lot, because I think the way that we demonstrate our value to an institution has to change and show how we're supporting them in these specific areas.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you for that, Emily. So Emily, Natya, and Jamie, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for joining us on the program. That was a wonderful conversation.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
the opportunity.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thanks.
You just heard from Natya Hans, Informatics and Reproducibility Librarian in the Academic Research and Consulting Services Department at the University of Florida, Emily McElroy, Vice President of Academic Relations at Taylor Francis, and Jamie Hutchins, Director of Open Research Americas at Taylor Francis. This episode was brought to you with generous support from Taylor Francis. As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising director, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant, Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.